prioritize your safety as well as the well-being of those around you.
So over 1,000 structures already that have been destroyed, 100,000+ people that have been evacuated, lives lost, traditions, lifestyles, places torn asunder.
I was sitting in the car by myself, and tears just came over my face. So, my entire history is in the house.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. This is a political show. It's America Decides, and I promise you there'll be plenty of politics, but I also promise we're going to keep a watchful and regular eye on a constellation of wildfires ravaging Los Angeles. Politics first. President-elect Trump is here in Washington to meet with Senate Republicans about his, quote, one big, beautiful bill. That is an umbrella statement talking about many parts of the incoming Trump administration's economic, energy, and immigration agenda. One of the main questions, how do you find agreement among Senate and House Republicans on the best way to proceed? Also, a New York judge is getting ready to sentence the incoming president for his felony convictions in the so-called criminal hush money case. No prison time will be involved in that. Nevertheless, Trump's legal team has asked the Supreme Court, did so today, to step in and block Friday's sentencing proceeding. Back to politics. We start, and we'll get to politics in a minute, but we're going to start, as I promised you, in California, where multiple fires are burning within the Los Angeles areas. In some parts of Los Angeles, the skies are so clogged with smoke that day looks like night. Thousands have been forced to flee their homes. Many more thousands might have to evacuate in the coming hours. Hundreds of buildings have been destroyed. At least 2 people have died. Many have been injured. This afternoon, fire officials briefed President Biden on the challenges of these many fires and how to battle them, with heavy winds among one of many problems. President Biden, while there, approved or intends to approve a major disaster declaration to boost the ranks of those on the front lines of these fires. We begin with CBS News correspondent Elise Preston, who joins us from Malibu. Elise, what have you witnessed today? What are you witnessing now?
Major, just total devastation. We are on the Pacific Coast Highway. It is smoky right behind me, but if you go down that roadway right there, on both sides, you will see homes just burned to the ground, charred, and there's still embers. Those are still incredibly dangerous because, as you can see, this wind here is picking up embers and just erupting those embers into flames in a matter of seconds. It's a continual stream of homes and businesses that have been destroyed. We're talking about 1,000 homes just from this fire. Keep in mind, though, that there are 4 separate fires burning in Southern California. So a lot of loss right here today.
Lisa, I'm glad you mentioned the embers. So for our audience's benefit, the problem with the high winds is that firefighters on the ground, if they try to create a fire break, the embers, propelled by the wind, go over that fire break and land somewhere else and create a new set of flames.
Yes, and it is incredible to see. We went back there. It wasn't safe for us to stay. We went back there to try to get a better vantage point for you and some of our other colleagues today. And there were a few embers that were just kind of hanging around on some houses. It looked like the fire was out, but we did see those embers kind of flying down. So we said, okay, let's step back. We don't want to get hurt. But then also, literally a second later, Major, I turned around and there was a huge flame that had just kind of erupted. And that fire kicked up again. And so it is just incredibly hard. These fires are not contained. They're nearly impossible to get under control right now, but firefighters are doing their best efforts. Because of the wind, they have not been able to attack these flames from the air, but we have seen some air support go up in the last hour. So hopefully that'll help them get some things under control.
Right, because when the wind is blowing 70, 80, 90 miles an hour, as it has, you can't fly helicopters or aircraft carrying either retardant or water. What is the word from public officials about what people should do and how they should prepare in case the evacuation orders expand?
Well, public officials are telling residents to listen to first responders. They're telling them that if a first responder tells you you need to evacuate, you need to evacuate. This fire is consuming so much, and it's so devastating. It tripled in size overnight. This fire is it's just too much, Major. And so they're telling people that you need to listen to first responders. A lot of times we'll cover fires and people say, you know, I want to stay here. I want to stay home. It's not just the structure that they want to stay there for, right? That house, they've worked their entire lives to be in that home. They've built memories, countless memories in that home with their family. So it's hard for a lot of people to leave. And so first responders are telling people, listen, we understand. We have been here before, but if this happens, you need to go.
Elise Preston, thank you very much, coming to us from Malibu. But coming up, President-elect Trump is in Washington tonight as he works to secure support for his legislative agenda. We will check in with our team who have the latest on the Trump transition. That's next. You're watching America Decides.
I like one big, beautiful bill, and I always have, I always will. But if two is more certain, it does go a little bit quicker because you can do the immigration stuff early.
President-elect Trump is set to meet with Senate Republicans on Capitol Hill tonight. As a matter of fact, his car is expected to arrive at the Capitol any minute now. We'll show you those pictures when they arrive. The contours of those discussions are as follows. There's a process by which the Trump agenda can pass the Senate with only 50 votes. The short term is called reconciliation. The question is, do you do one of those bills or two? And there are all sorts of complicating factors on which is a better strategy. Among the things President-elect Trump will discuss with Senate Republicans tonight. To help us understand that and other transition-related issues, Caitlin Huey-Burns joins us from West Palm Beach, Florida. Torian Small joins us from Capitol Hill. Caitlin, let's start with you. At the press conference yesterday at Mar-a-Lago, the President-elect basically said, I'm for either one of these things, depending on which is more successful. It's a big part of the Trump agenda. It's a big decision strategically and otherwise. True?
That's exactly right. And you mentioned this reconciliation process, and it's kind of a complicated, procedural issue that we've seen before, but it is a way for the Congress, especially the Senate, to be able to pass a piece of legislation with just majority support and not require that 60 vote threshold. That's a big way of saying there is an interest in getting a lot into one bill, at least on the House side, to be able to pass this with majority support and not have to, go through those procedural hurdles. What Trump is saying is essentially, yes, he wanted one big bill, but he's leaving it up to congressional leaders to decide which is the best way to go about it. And there are two different kind of main priorities for this administration incoming, which is part of it is addressing economic issues. Extending the Trump tax cuts is a big priority, and also the immigration component. And yesterday I asked the president-elect, how much can you do through executive order, or how much are you prioritizing Congress working on legislation to enact your immigration priorities? And he suggested that he could do a lot through executive order on immigration. So kind of reading the tea leaves there, suggesting that a big priority is to address these economic components. But this is a big issue, obviously, for Capitol Hill, where Torian is, because the House has an even slimmer majority than it had just last month. And we saw all of the wrangling that had to happen in order to get a budget bill passed. You still have a group of conservative lawmakers opposed to any new spending without any cuts in current spending. So this remains a big challenge. So as much as we're talking about the procedural hurdles, the issue at hand is getting the president's agenda through a Congress that, even though he has control, his party has control, the margins are slim. Indeed, they are. Torian Small on Capitol Hill. And as I mentioned, when the president-elect arrives at the United States Capitol, we'll show you those pictures, should be any moment now. Torian, the president is there in part because he is in Washington in preparation for tomorrow's funeral for the 39th president of the United States, Jimmy Carter, that to be held at Washington National Cathedral, building in a conversation with Senate Republicans tonight to tease out the strategy. Give us your perspective from the Capitol.
Yeah, quite a busy week. I mean, also his confirmations, his appointees to his cabinet are seeking confirmation to see where the votes are there. So it's a pretty busy week. And it is interesting to note that as former President Jimmy Carter lies in state, Donald Trump will be on the Hill. It's expected that he's going to pay his respects before starting these conversations with Senate Republicans. But just a few days ago, I mean, just at the press conference, actually, he said he made clear to distance himself from Jimmy Carter when asked about his previous bad words about the former president. Though in his statements, he said that, you know, he respected what he's done for the country. Donald Trump, leading up to Election Day, said that Joe Biden will be remembered as a more ineffective president than Jimmy Carter. So it is a striking thing to note out here that he'll be looking to pass this agenda at the same time that the former president is lying in state. As Caitlin Huey-Burns brought up, this will be a key moment for Trump to gauge where his influence stands among the Republican conference in the Senate. The House has been pretty interesting to watch the splintering among policy priorities. And it's also something to note that Trump has invited several members of the House Republican Conference to West Palm Beach this weekend to continue those conversations, most notably the House Freedom Caucus members who were not necessarily on the same page during the House speakership vote just a week ago.
Caitlin, I want to go back to you to talk about something that was injected into the coverage of the Los Angeles fires today by the president-elect, reviving a long-running dispute with the current governor of California, Gavin Newsom, about water policy dealing with water in Northern California, making it to the Central Valley and Southern California farmers. The president-elect erroneously suggested that has something to do with water availability to fight these wildfires in Los Angeles. It does not by any stretch of the imagination, yet it stands out there and is part of the conversation. Help us out with this.
Yeah, Major, this is referring to a social media post that the president-elect made criticizing Gavin Newsom. And this goes back to this long-standing, essentially, gripe that he has with the governor of California as it pertains to water policy. I was with Donald Trump when he was campaigning last year, and he gave a press conference at his own resort in Southern California, just about 40 miles south of where those wildfires are. And he really railed against Gavin Newsom for water policy, essentially, you know, arguing that when Donald Trump was president, he signed in federal regulations to open up waterways from the north to the south. This was addressing issues that farmers had raised in terms of getting money to their, getting water to their crops. Gavin Newsom had sued over environmental concerns, implemented his own policy, and at that press conference last year, Trump said that he would withhold federal funding for California if Gavin Newsom didn't reverse course on his position here. The bigger issue at play, however, is that, you know, Donald Trump has done this over his, past administration, is doing it now, criticizing leaders in states suffering from a crisis at a time where politics really isn't at play here. People are wondering how they can get to safety, what's going to happen to their homes, how these fires are going to be put out. And Trump's interest here is in terms of politics and going after the governor of a state suffering from something like this, reviving old feuds, and as you mentioned, erroneously attributing that to what's happening here.
Caitlin Huey-Burns in West Palm Beach, Torian Small on Capitol Hill. Thank you very much. Tonight, President Jimmy Carter, as I mentioned, is lying in state at the U.S. Capitol ahead of tomorrow's funeral at the National Cathedral. Next, our Robert Costa will join us with more on the 39th president's life and political legacy. You are watching America Decides. We are seeing, that is President-elect Trump's motorcade arriving at the steps of the United States Senate. That means President-elect Trump has arrived. And there's a couple of things going on tonight. One for sure, meeting with Senate Republicans to go over strategy legislatively and otherwise. We've already discussed that. And if at some point in the very near future, President-elect Trump goes to the Capitol Rotunda to pay his personal respects to the casket of the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, we will, of course, bring those pictures to you should they occur. Meanwhile, President Carter's state funeral will be held tomorrow. In the wake of his death last month, one of the few surviving members of the 39th president's inner circle is recalling key moments from their decades-long relationship. Jerry Rafshoon, Gerald is his first name, former communications director for President Carter, recently sat down with our Robert Costa for an exclusive interview about his time working for the former president. He was one of the few who approached Carter and encouraged him to run for president roughly a half-century ago. He was one of those early advocates on that presidential run, which ultimately proved to be a success. Robert Costa joins us now. Robert, the main takeaways.
Great to be with you, Major. Well, last night I went to the U.S. Capitol, where President-elect Trump is visiting right now, and I went and paid my own respects to the late President Carter. But so striking is to see the thousands of people lining up, even late at night last night, to stand there and say a prayer or simply pay their respects in their own way to the 39th President of the United States. And in recent weeks, I've had the opportunity to sit down with Jerry Rafshoon, a longtime Carter confidant who's 90 years old, to talk about the journey from this unknown governor and really state senator when Rafshoon met him in 1966 to become this person who's so venerated after a life that lasted the length of a century. And it really comes down, Major, you're such a student of history and politics, to the idea that Jimmy Carter could be created as an idea back in 1966, 1970, ultimately in 1976. And Jerry Rafshoon is someone who helped Carter conceptualize how you could package a Southern governor to the country and make it appealing, seem fresh, especially in that post-Watergate era.
There were three things happening at that time. There was the emergence of the so-called New South. Jimmy Carter wanted to be the face of it, if not the face, one of them. There was an evangelical Christian movement in this country reviving itself, and there was a political component to that that Jimmy Carter at least thought he could associate himself with. And there was also this crisis in confidence about those who were experienced Washington hands. The country, because of Vietnam and Watergate, saw two experienced Washington hands, Lyndon Johnson and then Richard Nixon, and had an idea that maybe that wasn't what the country needed, that an outsider perspective, someone untouched by Washington, might be a better alternative. You put those three things together, and that's the foundation of the Carter candidacy.
Major, you're so right. And my conversation with Jerry Rafshoon revealed that he and others around Carter, like Hamilton Jordan and Jody Powell, saw in Carter's anti-establishment message in 1970 in that campaign for governor a framework, a blueprint for what could happen in 1976. And if you go back and watch Rafshoon's ads from 75, 76, it's all about framing Carter as the Washington outsider, anti-establishment. They've had their turn. It's time for this outsider to come in. And they didn't always lean into the faith as much in that 76 moment. It was about providing a fresh start for the country. And Carter, he was someone who had served his country in uniform in the U.S. Navy, had worked in a peanut business that he inherited from his father. But at the end of the day, he really cast himself, to your point about the New South, as someone who was not part of the segregationist, racist past. Atlanta was becoming this hotbed for growth, especially of the black leadership in this country. And Carter seized to capitalize on that in 1976, saying the South could be the key to the country's growth. And if you look back at that electoral map in 1976, Carter's not president if he doesn't win the South.
Exactly. How much did Jerry Rafshoon embrace the concept of the everyman president? Because Jimmy Carter did some things right out of the chute that struck many Americans as odd for an American president. No more hail to the chief. That was then revived. Walking down Pennsylvania Avenue, carrying his own luggage. Things like that that I know President Carter thought made him look more approachable, reasonable, touchable as a chief executive. But some Americans thought, wait a minute. We like a little distance from our president. We like a little aspect of it that he is a larger-than-life figure. What was Rafshoon on that approach?
Well, the importance of Rafshoon is that when you think back to Carter, it's easy to look back at his life and career and think it's some Horatio Alger story. He just comes out of nowhere in Plains, Georgia, is plucked out of the obscurity to become president of the United States.
Never happens that way.
It never happens that way. Jerry Rafshoon started his career in Hollywood as a marketing executive for 20th Century Fox, worked on films like Cleopatra back in the 1960s. And he saw in Carter an opportunity to use cinema verite. Instead of doing packaged television ads where Carter would be speaking solemnly to the camera, they went to Plains, had Carter take off his jacket, put on a plaid shirt, shuck peanuts, talk to his neighbors. There was no more kind of kitschy country western jingle. It was all about, almost like the cinema. You're a student of cinema, too. in the 1970s, that kind of rawness.
Yes.
And Carter coupled that sensibility together with his own outsider ethos, and he made something that was very politically potent.
And the Allman Brothers and Leonard Skinner and Bob Dylan were along for the ride. That's another part of the story.
Hunter S. Thompson. I mean, it's all part of this Carter story.
Someday we'll talk about the music of Jimmy Carter. Robert Costa, always a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
As we have mentioned, we're going to keep an eye on the wildfires. They're burning out of control in Southern California. Containment 0%. This historic blaze and the latest on the battle against the flames. That's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. What you're seeing here happened just moments ago. President-elect Donald Trump, First Lady-to-be Melania Trump, approaching the casket of the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, inside the Capitol Rotunda to pay their respects. Let's just watch this for a moment. President-elect Trump and First Lady-to-be Melania lingering at the casket of 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, inside the Capitol Rotunda. The President-elect due to leave that location within the Capitol and head to a meeting with Senate Republicans. President Biden, meanwhile, says he thinks he could have beaten Donald Trump in the 2024 election. But in an interview with USA Today, one of the very few interviews President Biden has granted as he prepares to exit the White House, the president admitted he's not sure that had he won, he would have had the stamina to serve for another 4 years. Here's a quote from President Biden: "Who knows what I'm going to be when I'm 86 years old," unquote. Writer and documentary filmmaker Chris Whipple joins us now. He is the author of the upcoming book, Uncharted: How Trump Beat Biden, Harris, and the Odds in the Wildest Campaign in History. That book, I'm glad to tell you, and I look forward to it, comes out in April. Chris, it's great to see you.
Hey, good to see you, Major.
So, President Biden gives an interview to Susan Page, USA Today, and says he thinks he could have beaten Donald Trump. How do you regard that assertion, Chris?
Yeah, really remarkable, but not all that surprising. I mean, one of his closest friends told me that Joe Biden looks in the mirror almost every night, and depending on whether he's seen Trump on television that day, he says to himself, I could have beaten that blanking guy. And it's delusional. I mean, I think that we all know, any objective observer watching that debate, that pivotal debate in June 27, knows that that Joe Biden really couldn't have run an effective re-election campaign, much less served for another 4 years. But this conviction on Biden's part goes way, way back, and he's always felt that it was the elites and the press who underestimated him. And of course, in 2020, he finished fourth in Iowa and fifth in New Hampshire and came back and defied the odds. So he still believes it.
Do you think he possesses, based on your knowledge and reporting, Chris, any regrets about not seeing the campaign through, whatever its ultimate outcome?
I don't know about that. I mean, I think that he's smart enough and realistic enough to know that that fateful weekend, July 2021, which I write all about in my upcoming book, and I can't tell you too much about it because my editor would kill me this far in advance. But he was realistic enough to know that there was no path for him because the party leaders had turned against him. And come Monday morning or shortly thereafter, after that fateful weekend, I think everybody would have been coming out against him. He knew that he couldn't carry a totally divided party to victory. But that's a different question from whether he thinks the voters would have come around. And I think he still believes that.
He said in his interview with Susan Page, USA Today, that he hopes history will judge him as someone who brought the country back from the pandemic, stabilized the economy, and reasserted American global leadership. Do you think that is an apt summary of his legacy?
Well, I think his legacy is going to be mixed, Major, because on the one hand, he really did, as I wrote in my book about Biden's first 2 years, he really did come into office facing the most daunting challenges since FDR's time. An economy in free fall, a once-in-a-century pandemic. He stopped that free fall. He brought us through the pandemic. He passed major legislation in a 50-50 Congress. He rallied the West against an invasion of the largest democracy in Europe, and that's a pretty impressive legacy. But it's mixed because, as we all know, he really had a blind spot toward the, toward the ravages of inflation, failed to do anything about the border, and ultimately handed the baton to a candidate who could not beat Donald Trump. And so that's going to be a major part of his legacy as well.
Chris Whipple, always a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Good to be with you.
President Biden got briefed this afternoon on the massive wildfires in and around Los Angeles, fueled in part by climate change. We take a look at the outgoing president's record on that issue. That's next. You're watching America Decides.
President Biden's actions yesterday on offshore drilling, banning offshore drilling, will not stand. I will reverse it immediately. It'll be done immediately. And we will drill, baby, drill.
Welcome back to America Decides. President-elect Trump has made it clear he has a rather extensive to-do list. Part of that to-do list is, as he just mentioned, reversing executive actions taken by outgoing President Biden. As we look at the transition of power and prepare for it, we're also looking back at some of the most important elements of the Biden environmental legacy, and that feeds into some of the daily coverage today. The president was this afternoon, Eastern time that is, in Santa Monica, California, where he and Governor Gavin Newsom were briefed on the deadly wildfires in and around Los Angeles. I want to bring in CBS News environmental correspondent David Schechter. David, what's the headline on Biden's climate change legacy, if you could summarize it?
Sure, Major. Well, I think no president, the facts show, no president in history has done more to tackle climate change and cut the nation's greenhouse gas emissions. His signature piece of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, committed $370 billion of new investment for our transition to a green economy. Part of that was cutting the cost of electric vehicles. There's a $7,500 tax credit for families to buy electric vehicles, which has really juiced the market for those cars. He set goals for net zero greenhouse gas emissions, which mean in the future we'll have our emissions will equal the amount of emissions we put in the atmosphere will equal the amount of emissions that we take out. And if you look at the curve right now, sort of the biggest contribution is that our emissions have plateaued and are starting to go down. That is a huge accomplishment. We are nowhere near where we need to be in order to keep the world at the safest level of climate change, but on our way.
David, it has often been said that unless the United States leads in this matter, other international partners are not going to follow suit. And those less developed economies reasonably say, hey, wait a minute, why should we restrict ourselves from economic growth if it's fueled by fossil fuels? You didn't, America. How does Biden's legacy on the international stage fit into that conversation?
Well, you laid out that complexity really well. The United States is the largest emitter of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions over time. Right now, China, for example, has more, but the U.S. over time, our cumulative contributions are much larger. So I think the way President Biden looked at this is that our nation has a responsibility to lead on this issue. On day one of his administration, he rejoined the Paris Agreement, this international agreement for the nations of the world to work together on this issue. President Trump pulled us out of that agreement on his first day in office. And one of the things that happened over that period of time is that Biden and the U.S. have pledged almost $12 billion to help nations around the world, developing nations in particular, start to get on the road to their own green economy, just like the United States is. So his leadership on that stage has been significant, but you're right, it's a really thorny place because there are so many competing interests needing to get to the same goal, but all these countries look at this differently and can be quite contentious.
David, where do you expect President-elect Trump to attempt to reverse Biden policy swiftest?
I think the first place is he's going to, it seems pretty clear, remove the United States again from the Paris agreements. That would be the first thing that he would do. He said that he would do that. He will implement, most likely, drilling on federal lands. That's a lot of that drill, baby, drill that we've heard him talk about. Loosen fuel efficiency standards, which have been on the rise, and bring those down. And then maybe relax regulations on power plants that have tried to reduce the amount of emissions and carbon dioxide that come out of there. We're sort of expecting a lot of action almost from the very beginning, particularly reversing any of Biden's executive actions. That'd be the easiest place to start. A lot of these other things may end up in court or have to go through Congress.
David Schechter, thank you very much for your perspective and reporting. Appreciate it. That does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.